You will remember the yard before you remember how it got there. 91 degrees at 4 in the afternoon, the kind of Missouri heat that turns gravel into a griddle and makes the cicadas sound like a warning siren that never shuts off. A farmhouse with peeling white paint, a sagging porch, a chain-link fence rusted the color of dried blood. And in that yard, 160 motorcycles parked in rows, so straight they might have been drawn with a ruler. Engines silent, kickstands down, leather-clad men and women standing beside them, with their hands folded in front of them, like men at a funeral they had all agreed, without discussion, to attend. No one spoke. That was the strangest part if you had driven past on Route 9 that Tuesday in August and slowed your truck to stare. The strangest part was not the number of them, though the number was staggering. It was the quiet. Men who had spent decades being loud with their engines and their voices and their reputations stood there saying nothing at all, waiting on something smaller than any one of them. They were waiting on a boy. 9 years old, barefoot in the dry grass, a boy who had not spoken a single word in 311 days, since the morning his father's flag-draped casket was lowered into the ground at a veterans' cemetery an hour outside Iron Ridge. He stood in the center of that impossible congregation of leather and chrome and old war wounds, holding something in his fist so tightly his knuckles had gone white, and when he finally opened his mouth, the sound that came out was small enough that the men in the back rows had to lean forward to catch it. Stay with this. By the end you will know exactly what he said, and exactly why 160 riders drove 400 miles in the space of 11 hours to hear it. You will know what was in his hand, and what it cost a dead man to put it there. If that promise is enough to keep you, then subscribe, tell us what town you're watching from tonight, and stay until the yard goes quiet. But to understand a yard full of grown men gone silent for a child, you have to go back 3 weeks, to a gas station on the edge of a town most maps have stopped bothering to print. On a morning when the temperature was already climbing past 90, before the sun had fully cleared the tree line, and a Vietnam-era biker, with 40 years of road behind him, was doing nothing more than filling a tank, unaware that a boy was watching him from across the pumps, the way a man watches a door he isn't sure he's allowed to walk through. The gas station sat alone on a stretch of asphalt that had cracked in patterns like dry riverbeds, and the pumps were the old kind, the kind that clicked instead of beeped, numbers spinning slow enough that a man could watch his money disappear 1 digit at a time. He wore a leather cut gone soft and pale at the shoulders from decades of sun, and beneath it a t-shirt dark with sweat down the spine. His beard was gray going white at the chin, his hands thick-knuckled and scarred across the backs, in a way that told of bar fights decades settled, or engine work gone wrong, and maybe both. He did not look at the boy right away. He had learned, in places he did not talk about, that looking too fast made people bolt, made them freeze, made them decide you were one more threat in a life already too full of them. The boy stood near the ice cooler, barefoot on concrete hot enough to blister, in a t-shirt too big for him, the collar stretched loose around a neck that looked too thin. He did not ask for anything. He did not move toward the door, or the bathroom, or the candy rack the way children do out of habit and hunger. He simply stood, watching the biker the way a man watches weather rolling in, not afraid exactly, but reading it, calculating something private behind eyes that seemed older than the rest of him by 20 years. The biker finished with the pump, racked the nozzle, and reached for his wallet to go pay, and that was when the boy crossed the distance between them, quick and quiet as a held breath, and put his hand out. There was something in it. The biker looked down before he looked up, an old habit, hands before faces, and saw a length of chain, tarnished silver, and 2 rectangular tags worn smooth at the edges from years against someone's skin. He did not take them right away. He crouched instead, slow, the way a man crouches when his knees have earned the right to complain about it, until he was eye level with a boy who had not yet made a single sound. "You want me to hold these for you, son?" The boy shook his head. He pressed them harder into the biker's palm, closing the calloused fingers around them himself, and the biker felt the stamped letters under his thumb before he ever turned them to the light, a unit designation he had not heard spoken aloud in over 50 years, one that belonged, impossibly, improbably, to a man he had buried in a country neither of them had wanted to die in. He turned the tags to the light anyway, because a man does not trust his own memory when his memory has just handed him something this heavy. The stamping was government issue, block letters pressed into metal by a machine that did not care whose chest it would hang against, and below the name and the blood type and the string of numbers that meant nothing to anyone who had not carried a rifle through triple canopy jungle, there was the insignia, a spade, a single word beneath it, half worn away, the kind of thing you would miss entirely unless you had spent 13 months learning to read it in the dark, on another man's collar, across a perimeter, in the second before the world went white and loud. He had not heard that unit spoken aloud since a funeral he had flown 11 hours to attend, in a town smaller than this one, where he had stood in the back row because the family had not known his name, only that their son had written it in letters home. Brother. That was the word the boy had used. Not friend. Brother. The tags did not belong to that man. They could not. 51 years was too long a bridge for two hands to build across. One dead in a rice paddy outside a village whose name the biker had spent 5 decades trying to forget. The other alive enough, apparently, to have fathered a boy who now stood in the heat outside a gas station with his mouth shut like a door nailed from the inside. But the unit did not lie. The unit was too specific, too rare, too small a slice of a war that had swallowed 500,000 men whole, for this to be some coincidence, handed down through a pawnshop bin. "Where did you get these?" the biker said, and it was not really a question, because a question implies the asker does not already suspect the answer will cost him something. The boy did not speak. He reached instead into the pocket of shorts gone thin at the knee, the fabric the color dust turns when it has been washed too many times in water that was never quite clean, and drew out a folded square of paper, soft at the creases the way paper gets when it has been folded and unfolded by small anxious hands more times than anyone could count, and held it out the same way he had held out the tags, not offering, exactly. Delivering. The biker took it. His knees complained again as he stood, and the boy's eyes followed the paper up, and stayed there, waiting, the way a person waits who has already decided that whatever comes next is not really his to control anymore. The paper had been folded into quarters and then folded again, a small, stubborn square, and when the biker opened it, the crease lines had gone soft and gray, threatening to give at the center, where a boy's thumb had pressed too many times against words he could not read for himself. Not fully, not the cursive parts, only the shapes he had been told to memorize like a psalm. It was a woman's handwriting, rounded, hurried, the kind of hand that writes fast because someone is calling from another room. 3 lines. An address on Route 9 past the feed store, the kind of address that in a town like this needed no number because everyone already knew which house had gone quiet after the funeral. Beneath it, a name that was not the boy's name, and beneath that, in different ink, added later, smaller, as if the hand had trembled saying it. "He sells what your daddy left. Don't let him sell you too." The biker read it twice. The heat did something strange in his chest, a heaviness that had nothing to do with the sun, and he found that his hands, which had not shaken in the 11 years since he'd quit drinking, were not entirely steady now. He looked at the boy. The boy looked back the way he had looked at everything since the pumps, dead level, unblinking, a child's face wearing a soldier's patience, and the biker understood, with the particular clarity that comes only to men who have buried people, that this patience had been taught to him. Nobody is born knowing how to wait like that. It gets carved into you. "Who wrote this?" the biker said. The boy's mouth opened. Nothing came. His jaw worked once, twice, the way a hinge works on a door that has rusted shut from disuse rather than damage, and then he closed it again and looked down at his own bare feet on the scalding concrete, and the biker understood that too, that the not speaking was not stubbornness, was not shyness, was a door that had been closed so long the boy himself might not remember how to open it. Behind them, the gas station attendant had come out onto the step to smoke, watching the two of them with the mild, incurious attention of a man who had seen every kind of stranded traveler this stretch of blacktop could produce. And behind him, the highway shimmered white-hot toward the horizon, empty in both directions, and the biker folded the paper along its old creases and put it in his shirt pocket, over his heart, where the dog tags had gone a moment before, and he crouched down again so that his eyes were level with the boy's. "I need you to show me something," he said. "Can you do that?" The boy's chin dropped once, not quite a nod, closer to a decision. The boy led him around the side of the station, past a rusted ice machine that hummed with the particular strain of a compressor decades past its warranty, past a chained-up air pump nobody had used since gas cost half of what it did now, to a bicycle lying on its side in the gravel, front wheel bent into something closer to an ellipse than a circle. He crouched beside it and set it upright with the tenderness of a man handling something wounded, and the boy watched him do it, watched his hands, the missing first knuckle on the left ring finger, the tattoo on the forearm faded to the color of a healing bruise, an eagle that had once had sharper edges, the way a smaller creature watches a larger one to determine whether it intends harm. The bicycle had been ridden a long way. That much was plain from the dust caked into the chain, the way the tires had gone soft and thin, the water bottle cage that held no bottle. He asked no questions the boy would have to answer with more than his body, because he understood already that words were not currency here, that every question was a toll the boy could not pay. Instead he asked what direction, and pointed one way and then the other, and the boy's eyes went, without hesitation, west, toward the low brown hills that gave Iron Ridge its name and its color both. 14 miles, he guessed. Maybe more with the bends the county road took through the dry creek bed. He should have called someone then. He would think that later, many times, turning it over the way a man turns over a coin he already spent, he should have walked back inside and used the payphone, bolted to the wall by the restroom, and let the machinery of the state begin its slow grinding. But the boy had put the tags in his hand and not in anyone else's, had chosen him specifically out of a stranded highway's worth of strangers, and there was a debt in that choice he did not yet understand but already felt obligated to honor. He asked if he could put the bike on the truck. The boy did not answer, but he did not stop him either, and that, the biker had learned a long time ago in a country far from this one, was sometimes the only permission a person had left to give. The attendant watched them load the bent bicycle into the bed of the pickup without comment, cigarette burning down toward his knuckles, and somewhere behind the counter, a radio gave the noon temperature as 106 degrees, and the boy climbed into the passenger seat and sat with his hands folded in his lap like a boy in church, and the biker started the engine and pointed it west, toward the hills, toward whatever the 14 miles was going to cost him. The road out of the station ran straight for the first mile and then began to climb, the asphalt buckling in places where the heat had worked its patient violence on it for 40 summers, and the truck's tires found each seam with a small percussive sigh. He drove with the window down because the air conditioning had died somewhere around the second Bush administration and never been resurrected, and the wind that came through smelled of creosote and dry grass and, faintly, of the diesel exhaust from a hay truck that had passed them going the other direction 10 minutes before. The boy did not look at him. He looked instead at the glove compartment, which was cracked and held shut with a bungee cord, and at the crucifix that hung from the rearview mirror on a rosary gone gray with dust, and at nothing at all for long stretches, his eyes fixed on some middle distance that existed only for him. The dog tags rode in the biker's shirt pocket now, against his sternum, and every few minutes his hand found them there, the way another man's hand might find a rosary or a lucky coin, an unconscious pilgrimage of fingers checking that a thing was still real. The unit insignia had been stamped into the metal decades before this boy was born, before this boy's father was born, maybe, and the biker did the arithmetic without wanting to, and arrived nowhere good. He thought about a man he had known for 11 months in 1969, a man with a laugh like a screen door and a habit of writing his mother twice a week without fail, a man who had gone into a tree line outside a village whose name the biker had spent 30 years trying to forget and had not come out of it, and he understood, with the flat certainty of a fact rather than a feeling, that whatever thread connected that man to this silent boy in the passenger seat was not a thread he had chosen to pick up. It had been handed to him. There was a difference, and the difference mattered. He passed a mailbox leaning sideways like a drunk, and a burned-out shell of a barn with only its stone foundation left standing, black with old fire, and a hand-painted sign, advertising eggs that looked as though no one had bought eggs from that address in a decade. The boy's folded hands tightened slightly in his lap when they passed a gravel drive with a chained gate, and the biker noted it the way he had once noted the tension in a jungle before it told him anything a person could name, and said nothing, and drove on. 4 miles left, then 3. The boy's jaw worked once, as if a word were trying to climb out of him and finding no door. The road narrowed the way a throat does before a scream, hedgerows crowding close on either side, kudzu swallowing an old fence line whole, and the biker eased off the throttle without deciding to, some part of him already downshifting for terrain his conscious mind hadn't yet named as dangerous. 2 miles. The boy's breath had changed. It was shallow now, high in the chest, the way breath goes when a body remembers something the mind has locked a door against, and the biker had heard that breathing before, in men 3 times this boy's age, in a debriefing tent with the flaps rolled up and nowhere near enough light. He did not reach over. He had learned, decades ago, that a hand offered too soon closes a door that patience might have opened on its own, and so he kept both hands on the wheel and let the silence do what silence does, which is wait. A crop duster passed low overhead, its shadow rippling across the hood like something startled, and the boy flinched. Not large, not dramatic, just a small seizing of the shoulders, and then went still again, stiller than before, as if ashamed of the flinch. The biker filed that too. A boy who apologizes with his body for being afraid has been taught, somewhere, by someone, that fear is an inconvenience to other people. 1 mile. A rural mailbox, dented, the number painted over twice in 2 different whites, neither of them matching. Behind it, a lane of packed dirt curving away past a listing tool shed and a rusted swing set with one chain snapped and dragging in the dust, and past that, low and long and sagging at the roofline, like something that had simply stopped trying, a farmhouse. The biker slowed the truck to a crawl he told himself was caution, and knew was something closer to dread. The dog tags were still in his shirt pocket, and he could feel them there, a small, cold weight against his sternum, and he thought of the note folded inside them, the handwriting he did not yet let himself think too hard about, and he thought of the tree line outside that village he had spent 30 years trying to forget, and how nothing, in his experience, that arrived wrapped in silence, ever turned out to be small. The boy's hand moved, not toward the door, toward the biker's forearm, resting on the console between them, and stopped an inch short of touching it, hovering there the way a hand hovers over a stove it has been burned by before. "You don't have to come in," the biker said. The boy's head turned toward the house, and did not shake, and did not nod. The truck's engine ticked as it cooled, though he had not turned it off, and the sound of it seemed louder than it should have been in that stillness, louder than the wind moving through the dead cornstalks on either side of the drive. He studied the house the way he had once studied tree lines, the way a man learns to read a landscape for what it is hiding rather than what it is showing. A curtain in the front window, yellowed and torn along one seam, a screen door hanging by its top hinge, swinging a half-inch in the wind and then stopping, swinging and stopping, like something breathing in its sleep. No dog, no truck in the yard save one, jacked up on blocks with its hood open and rusted through, abandoned mid-repair the way a lot of things out here seem to be abandoned mid-repair, mid-anything, as if the whole property had lost its nerve halfway through some larger task and never picked it back up. He counted the windows, 4 in front, dark behind every one of them despite the hour, despite the sun still high enough to throw the fence-line shadows long and thin across the dust. The boy had not moved his hand from the console. It hovered there still, an inch from the biker's forearm, and the biker found himself holding very still, the way he might have held still for a man easing a blade back into its sheath, not wanting to startle whatever fragile transaction was happening in that small suspended distance. "Your stepdad home?" he asked. "Nothing." Then the boy's eyes went to the house and held there, and something in his jaw tightened, a small muscle working beneath skin gone pale despite the heat, and the biker understood that this was an answer, that silence out here had its own grammar, and he was only now beginning to learn to read it. He put the truck in park. He did not reach for the door handle yet. "I'm gonna need you to stay right here a minute," he said, keeping his voice low and level, a voice built for calming spooked animals and frightened men, the only two things he had ever really learned to talk to gently. "Can you do that for me?" The boy's hand withdrew from the console, slow, and folded back into his lap, and he nodded once, barely, his eyes never leaving the house. The biker opened the door. The heat outside hit him like something with weight to it, and the dust rose thin and gold around his boots as he stepped down, and somewhere behind that sagging roofline, a screen door creaked open on its ruined hinge, and a shape appeared in the dark rectangle of the doorway, watching him come. The shape in the doorway did not move for a long moment, and the biker let it not move, because he had learned a long time ago, in a country that no longer existed on any map he trusted, that the first one to move was often the one giving something away. The yard between them was hard-pan dirt gone the color of old bone, scattered with a rusted swing set missing one chain, a doghouse with no dog, a propane tank leaning like it had given up standing straight years ago. He walked into it slow, boots finding their own rhythm, hands loose and open and visible at his sides, an old habit from an older war, the habit of a man who understood that hands said things faces could still lie about. "Afternoon," he said, when he was close enough that shouting wasn't required. The shape resolved into a man, maybe 40, gone soft in places and hard in others, a face that had once perhaps been handsome, and now carried the loose, unfinished look of something left out too long in weather. He wore no shirt, and his jeans hung low on hips gone narrow with something that wasn't hunger for food, and his eyes did the thing eyes do when they are deciding how much of the truth the situation requires. "Help you?" the man said, and there was no help in the word at all, only a door being tested for how hard it could be shut. "Boys out in the truck," the biker said, wanted to make sure somebody knew where he was. Something moved through the man's face then, quick, there and gone, and the biker filed it away the way he filed away everything. The flicker of calculation before the performance of concern arrived a half-second too late to be believed. "He run off again," the man said, not a question, shaking his head like a man discussing weather, an inconvenience, a leaking roof. "Kid does that, ever since." He stopped himself, and the stopping told the biker more than the sentence would have. "Since his daddy," the biker said. The man's eyes narrowed a fraction. "You knew him?" "No," the biker said, and this was true, and also somehow not the whole truth, because he had known him, had known 100 versions of him, brothers in a unit patch worn soft with years, men who did not come home whole, or did not come home at all. He reached into his jacket, slow, and the man's whole body tightened, some animal memory of consequences surfacing behind his eyes, and the biker noted that too. He drew out nothing more than the dog tags, held them loose on their chain, letting them turn once in the white light. "Boy gave me these." The screen door creaked again behind the man, though no wind moved it, and somewhere inside the house, something scraped across a floor, slow, deliberate, like a box being dragged toward a door that did not want to be found. The man's eyes went to the tags and stayed there a moment too long, the way a man looks at a debt he thought he'd buried. He did not reach for them. He did not ask to see them closer. That, too, the biker filed away, the way he had once filed away the sound of a safety clicking off in deep grass, the way a body remembers danger long after the mind has told it to relax. "Those his," the man said, not a question either. His voice had gone flatter, the weather talk drained out of it. "Yeah," the biker said, "they are." The scraping sound came again from inside the house, closer to the door now, and the man's jaw worked once, a small tightening, and he half turned his head toward the house without fully committing his body, a man caught between two currents, and choosing, for the moment, to stand still in both. "He shouldn't be carrying that stuff around," the man said. "Losing things. Boy loses everything." The biker said nothing. He had learned, in another life, that silence pulled more truth out of a man than any question could, that a question gave a man time to build a wall, and silence simply waited for the wall to crack on its own weight. He watched the man's hands, which had gone to his pockets, then come back out empty, then gone back in again, restless, a tell if he had ever seen one, and God knew he had seen plenty, across folding tables and interrogation rooms, and barroom corners for 40 years. You got a name, the man said finally, and it came out almost like an accusation, like the biker had trespassed simply by existing on the gravel. Folks call me Gunner, he said, and watched that land nowhere. No recognition, no history, just a name to a stranger, which was fine, because names were not what he had come for. The screen door opened another few inches on its own weight, and in the dark gap behind it, low, at the height of a 9-year-old's eyes, something pale moved and went still, watching. Gunner did not look at it directly. He had learned that too, once, in another country, in another kind of grass, that the surest way to make something bolt was to look at it head on. "Boy inside?" he asked, mild as the heat itself. "Somewhere," the man said, and this time the shrug came a half-second too late, practiced instead of natural, and Gunner thought of the note folded soft in his own jacket pocket, 4 words in a child's careful hand, and felt something in his chest go quiet and cold, and very, very certain, the way it used to go, before a decision that could not be walked back. The man's shrug settled back into his shoulders like a coat he'd worn too long, and Gunner let the silence stretch the way he used to let silence stretch in the bush, because silence was a tool same as any wrench or blade, and most men could not stand to hold it for more than a few seconds before they filled it with something true. This one held it longer than most, long enough that Gunner revised his estimate of him upward, then, just as quickly, downward again, because a man who could hold silence that well had usually learned it the same place Gunner had, by having something to hide. "You always talk to strangers about the boy," the man said, "or just today." "Just today," Gunner said. "Ran into him at the Conoco. He was polite." That word, polite, did something to the man's face that Gunner filed away and did not comment on, a tightening at the jaw, a small private arithmetic behind the eyes, the kind men do when they are recalculating what a stranger might know, and whether that knowledge is dangerous, and to whom. "Kid doesn't talk," the man said. "You know that. Whole town knows that." "Didn't say he talked." "Then what'd he say to you, with all that politeness?" Gunner did not answer right away. Behind the man, the screen door had gone still again, but the pale shape had not withdrawn. It had only gone lower, the way a small animal goes lower when it senses the air changing, and Gunner understood, with the same cold certainty that had settled into him on the porch step, that the boy was listening to every word being spoken about him as though he were a piece of furniture, a fixture of the property, a thing that did not require a voice of its own because none had asked for one. "He gave me something," Gunner said finally. "I came to ask about it." "Gave you something?" The man's voice flattened. "Boy doesn't have anything to give. Boy doesn't own so much as the shirt on him. He owned this." Gunner reached into his jacket, slow, the way you move around something that might spook, and drew out the dog tags, letting them catch what light there was, the chain swinging once, twice, before he closed his fist around them again. He watched the man's eyes go to the tags and stay there a half-second too long. Recognition, sure and unmistakable. The recognition of a man who has handled a thing before and knows its weight without needing to touch it. "Where'd he get those?" the man said, and his voice had lost its lazy edge entirely now, gone thin and quick, and Gunner heard in it the sound of a door, somewhere inside a man's own house, being tested to see if it's still locked. Gunner didn't answer right away. He had learned, 40 years back in a country where silence could be the difference between waking up and not, that the first question was rarely the real one, and a man in a hurry to have his question answered was a man who already knew the answer and was hoping you didn't. He didn't get them, Gunner said. They were his father's before him. That's so. The man's jaw worked, a small motion, chewing on something that wasn't there. His eyes cut sideways toward the house, toward the boy standing on the porch step now, one hand still gripping the rail like it was the only fixed point left in a world that kept tilting under him. Boy's confused, been confused since his daddy passed, says things, don't say things mostly, but when he does, they don't always hold up. He didn't say anything. Gunner let the words sit. He didn't have to. Something shifted in the man's face then, a tightening around the mouth, and Gunner watched him recalculate, watched him do the same arithmetic every cornered man does, What does this stranger know? How much of it can be walked back? What's the fastest road out of this yard with the least said? It was an old equation. Gunnar had seen it worked out on faces in interrogation rooms and barroom back lots and once, a long time ago, on his own father's face, in a kitchen in Ohio, over a bill that hadn't been paid. There a war medal in this? Gunnar asked. Flat, not a threat. A man asking a fact. The pause before the answer was its own answer. Man's got debts, the stepfather said finally, and there was something almost like relief in saying it, the relief of a guilty thing, finally given a name smaller than the truth. Everybody's got debts. Some things sitting in a drawer doing nobody any good, I don't see the harm. They were doing him good. Gunnar nodded toward the porch without turning his head, keeping the man in his sightline the way you keep a dog in your sightline, the way you keep anything that might bolt or bite. That's the thing about a boy who doesn't talk. Everybody figures there's nothing going on behind it. There's more going on behind it than in most rooms full of talking men. The wind moved through the yard, dragging a paper cup end over end across the gravel, and somewhere behind the house, a dog barked twice and stopped. The stepfather's eyes went once more to the fist Gunnar still held closed around the tags, and this time he didn't look away fast enough, and Gunnar understood, watching him, that he was looking not at metal but at inventory, counting, even now, what else there might be, what else could still be moved, what a boy's silence was actually worth to a man who had learned to read it as opportunity instead of grief. The caseworker had gone still in a way that meant she was listening now, really listening, the clipboard forgotten against her hip, her pen no longer moving across the page it had been pretending to fill. She had the look of someone recalculating a story she thought she already knew the ending to. Gunnar had seen that look before, on medics, on judges, on men who'd spent 30 years assuming the worst thing in a room was the thing making noise. "Ma'am," he said, not moving his eyes off the stepfather, "you might want to write some of this down." She did. The stepfather's jaw worked like he was chewing something that wouldn't go down easy. "You can't just, this is my property, my house, my say on what happens under this roof." It was his roof first. Gunnar tilted his head toward the boy, who stood near the porch steps with his hands loose at his sides, watching the exchange with the flat patience of someone who had learned long ago that adults talked past children the way weather talked past a fence post, around it, over it, never through it. "Deed's probably still got his father's name on it. That house behind you's probably still paying off a mortgage, a dead man signed. You didn't build any of this. You just moved into what was already standing and started selling off the furniture." Something crossed the stepfather's face then. Not shame, not yet, but the first cousin of it. The flinch a man gets when a lie he's told himself so many times it stopped feeling like a lie gets said back to him in someone else's voice, stripped of the varnish he'd put on it. He looked, for one unguarded second, less like a predator and more like a man drowning in numbers he couldn't make add up. A man who had found a house full of another man's belongings and told himself that debt made anything fair game. It didn't make him less dangerous. It made him more familiar, and familiar was worse. The caseworker cleared her throat. "I'll need to see the boys' room, and I'll need an inventory of what's left. Metals, personal items, anything belonging to the biological father's estate." "There's not much left," Gunnar said quietly, and it wasn't a question. The stepfather didn't answer that. He didn't have to. His silence did the work his mouth had been avoiding, and in the yard the wind kept moving, and somewhere far off past the tree line, a low sound was building that wasn't wind at all, a sound with weight to it, with rhythm, still faint enough that only a man who'd spent 40 years listening for trouble on a road would have caught it yet. Gunnar caught it. He didn't smile. He didn't move. But something in his shoulders eased half an inch, the way a man's shoulders ease when he stops carrying a weight alone. The boy heard it before anyone said a word about it. His head turned toward the tree line the way a compass needle turns, not from decision but from pull, and his hand found the hem of Gunnar's jacket again and held it the way a smaller child might hold a fence rail in high wind. The caseworker noticed the movement and followed his gaze, and for a moment all three of them stood in the yard listening to a sound that hadn't fully arrived yet, that existed only as a rumor of itself carried on hot air and dry grass. The stepfather heard it last, which was its own kind of answer. He had spent so long listening only for creditors and collection calls that he'd lost the ear for anything else, and when the sound finally reached him plainly enough to name, his face didn't go pale so much as it went still, the stillness of a man doing arithmetic he already suspects will not favor him. "What is that?" he said, and it came out flatter than a question deserved. Gunnar didn't turn around. He'd heard bikes on gravel roads for 4 decades. He didn't need his eyes to count them, only his chest, which had already begun translating the vibration into a number the way a man translates footsteps into how many people are coming up behind him in the dark. He knew it wasn't 8. He knew it wasn't 20. There was a depth to it, a layering, engines stacked on engines, until the sound stopped being individual machines and became a single moving thing, patient and unhurried, in no rush to arrive, because arrival wasn't the point. Presence was the point. The caseworker's pen had stopped over her clipboard. She was young enough that this was new to her, old enough in the job to know that new things in a yard like this were rarely good and rarely simple, and she watched Gunnar's face for a cue, the way people watch weathermen before a storm. "They're not coming to do anything," Gunnar said, to her, though his eyes were somewhere past the porch rail, past the fence line, out where dust was just beginning to lift gold in the afternoon light. "They're coming to stand here. Stand here and do what?" "Nothing," Gunnar said. "That's the whole point of it." The stepfather's mouth opened and then closed again, and something in the set of his shoulders, that same permission to anger he'd been leaning on all morning, folded in on itself, because a man can convince himself that one biker in his yard is an inconvenience he can outlast, a temporary storm to be waited out with folded arms and a raised voice. He cannot convince himself of that about 160. The boy's grip on the jacket hem tightened, and Gunnar, without looking down, laid his scarred hand over the small one and left it there, and the sound kept building, closer now, close enough that the porch boards seemed to hum faintly with it, close enough that even the dog on its chain by the barn lifted its head and went quiet, listening. The dust rose the way water rises before it breaks a levee, first a suggestion and then a certainty, and the caseworker set her clipboard down on the porch rail because her hands had started to want something to do with themselves. She had seen convoys before, sheriff's escorts, funeral processions for men who died with flags folded on their coffins, the long gray lines of vehicles that moved through small towns like something being carried rather than driven. She had never seen anything that sounded like this. 160 engines finding some communal register, the individual machines dissolving into a single low chord that came up through the ground before it arrived in the air. The stepfather stepped back from the rail without seeming to decide to. His boots scraped once against the boards, and he did not look at the boy, and he did not look at Gunnar, and he did not look, particularly, at anything, the way a man avoids looking at a wound he already knows is worse than he wants it to be. "That's not necessary," he said, to no one, or to the yard, or to the version of himself that still believed a raised voice carried weight in rooms like this one. Nobody answered him. The first bikes came around the bend where the county road bent toward the water tower, and then there were more behind them, and more behind those, riding not fast but steady, riding the way men ride when speed isn't the point, when the point is simply arriving, all of them, together, and being seen to arrive. Chrome caught the light and threw it back scattered across the dry grass. Leather cracked faintly under the layered patches. The dog by the barn had gone all the way silent now, ears flat, watching the road the way it might have watched weather rolling down off the ridge. Gunnar felt the boy's hand shift beneath his own, not pulling away, but pressing closer, fingers curling around 2 of his, and he did not look down at that either, because he understood, without needing to check, that if he looked down now, in front of this many people, in front of everything that was about to fill this yard, something in his own chest was going to give in a way he would not be able to put back together in time to be useful. So he watched the road instead. He watched the line of them come on, engine after engine after engine, dust lifting behind each rear wheel, like something being let go of, and he thought, distantly, of formations he had once stood in on hard-packed ground, on the other side of the world, men arriving in numbers, because numbers were the only language that some situations understood. The caseworker's hand had found her own throat. "Are they all coming here?" she said. "For him." Gunnar did not answer that either. The gate at the end of the drive was still closed, and the first riders were already close enough to read the patches. The gate did not open on its own. It hung there, sagging on one hinge, the kind of gate a man fixes for 6 years running and never fixes, and the boy's grip tightened another degree, as if he alone understood what it meant, that no one had come out of the house yet to see what the sound was. The dust the engines carried came in low, riding along the ditch grass, catching the light so that for a moment the whole line of them seemed to be arriving out of something older than the road itself, out of a year, out of a war, out of every version of arriving late that a man carries in his body, without ever naming it. The lead rider slowed his machine to a walking pace, then cut the engine, and one by one down the line the others did the same, so that the sound did not stop all at once but folded down, layer by layer, until what was left was the tick of hot metal cooling and the wind moving through dry grass that had not been cut since spring. The caseworker had not moved. She stood with her hand still at her throat, watching the patches resolve out of the dust, the winged skull, the number stitched below it, the small bars that meant things she did not know how to read but understood, on some old animal level, that she was not meant to argue with. She looked at Gunnar as if he might explain it to her in words that would make it smaller. He did not have those words. He had only ever had the ones that came before words, the ones a body learns standing in formation, waiting. The front door of the house opened a crack, then wider, and a man's shape filled it, unshaven, thinner than his voice would suggest, one hand still on the frame, as if the frame were the only thing holding the house up instead of the other way around. He looked at the yard. He looked at the number of them. Something in his face did the arithmetic and did not like the answer. Behind Gunnar, low, almost swallowed by the wind, he heard the first rider's boots hit gravel, unhurried, the walk of a man who had learned long ago that speed was for people who needed to prove something. No one spoke. That was the part the caseworker would try to describe later, to people who had not been there, and fail, that 160 men could stand in a dirt yard and make silence itself into a kind of pressure, a wall built without a single brick lifted. The boy's hand did not loosen. Gunnar felt him watching the door, watching the man in it, and understood that whatever came next in this yard, the boy had already decided who he trusted to stand between him and it. The stepfather's eyes moved along the fence line, counting jackets the way a man counts debts he cannot pay, and something in his shoulders dropped half an inch, the posture of a man recalculating what his voice was worth against this particular silence. He said a name. It was not the boy's name, it was Gunnar's, spoken like a curse learned secondhand, spat out with the practiced contempt of someone who had built his whole life on being the loudest thing in every room he entered. Nobody answered him. The wind took the word and scattered it over the dead grass, and none of the 160 men standing in that yard so much as shifted their weight, and the not answering was its own kind of answer, heavier than anything shouted back. The caseworker stepped forward then, clipboard against her chest like a small shield, and said she needed to speak with him, that this was a routine follow-up, that nothing had been decided. Her voice was steady, in a way Gunnar recognized, the voice of someone taught to sound calm over things that were not calm at all. The man's eyes flicked past her to the boy, to the small brown hand still buried in Gunnar's palm. Something crossed his face that might have been shame if he had been built to carry it, and instead came out as anger, quick and thin, the anger of men who mistake being seen for being attacked. "He's my son," the man said. "Don't matter what he told you, he don't talk." The words landed in the yard and stayed there, ugly and true and incomplete, because the boy had told no one anything, not with his mouth, and yet here were 160 men who had heard him anyway. Gunnar felt the boy's grip tighten, not in fear now but in something closer to fury, a 9-year-old fury too large for the body carrying it, and he understood in that moment that the boy had heard the sentence for what it was, not a defense but a diagnosis, the whole shape of the last year contained in 6 flat words. "Don't matter what he told you, he don't talk." As if silence were a design flaw and not a wound, as if a child who had buried his father and watched his father's medals disappear one by one into a stranger's cash drawer had chosen, out of some stubbornness, not to speak. The caseworker's pen moved. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of scorched grass and gasoline, and something under it, older, the copper smell of a house that had not been cleaned in a long time. Gunnar did not look at the man in the doorway. He looked down at the boy, at the small, stubborn set of his jaw, and waited, the way he had learned to wait in another country decades ago, for whatever came next to reveal itself on its own time. What came next revealed itself the way weather does, slow, and then all at once. The stepfather shifted his weight against the doorframe, and the boards under him gave a small complaint, and somewhere behind him in the dim hallway, a dog began barking at nothing, at the wrongness in the air that animals feel before people do. Gunnar counted the vests in the yard without turning his head, the way he had once counted men in tall grass, not out of fear but out of habit, out of the old necessity of knowing exactly what surrounded him, 60 at least on this side of the fence, more coming up the drive in a low dust cloud that hadn't settled yet. The caseworker's pen had stopped moving. She was looking past the stepfather now, into the house, at something Gunnar couldn't see from where he stood, and her face had gone the particular still color of a person recalculating everything they had been told. "Ma'am," she said, not to the stepfather, "I need to see the boy's room." "It's a mess," the man said. "Kid don't keep it up. I need to see it anyway." He didn't move at first. Then the dog barked again, sharper, and something in the man's shoulders folded, the posture of a man who has run out of sentences that work. He stepped back from the door, and the caseworker went past him into the dark of the house, and for a moment it was only the yard and the bikes, and the boy's hand still locked around Gunnar's fingers, the pressure of it steady now, no longer fear, no longer fury, something quieter that Gunnar didn't have a word for yet. The wind found a gap in the porch screen and pulled it once against its frame. A small metal sound, and no one spoke through it. 60 engines had gone silent an hour ago and stayed that way, and the silence had a weight to it now, had accumulated, the way heat accumulates in the hour after noon until it becomes a thing you can lean against. Gunnar had spent 40 years learning not to need company in moments like this, and he understood, standing in that yard with a boy's hand in his, that the men behind him weren't there to fill the silence. They were there to hold it steady, to make sure it didn't collapse into the kind of silence the boy had been living in for a year, the kind that empties a house instead of filling a yard. The caseworker's voice carried faintly from somewhere inside, low, asking a question, then quiet, then her footsteps on old floorboards, coming back toward the door, unhurried, deliberate, the walk of someone who had found exactly what she expected and none of what she wanted. She came out onto the porch holding a manila folder against her chest, like something that might blow away in a wind that had already died down to nothing, and she stopped at the top of the steps and looked at the boy before she looked at anyone else, which Gunnar noted the way he noted most things now, filing it without comment. "He kept receipts," she said, "in a shoebox, under the sink." Nobody answered her. The men in the yard didn't shift, didn't murmur, didn't do any of the small, restless things 160 men might be expected to do, standing in the heat that long. They watched her the way they'd watch weather coming, patient and unblinking, and she seemed to understand that her next words needed to be exact, because exact words were the only currency this yard would accept. 4 pawn tickets. 2 from Iron Ridge, 1 from Callum, 1 from a shop in Presley I've never heard of. She opened the folder, then closed it again, as if she'd decided the men didn't need to see the paper to believe her. Dates going back 14 months. Amounts that don't match what he told his creditors he owed. The stepfather, sitting now on the bottom step with his forearms on his knees, made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a word, and nobody looked at him. "There's a silver star listed on one of them," she said, and her voice, for the first time, lost its careful flatness. "Sold for $60. Gunnar felt the boy's hand tighten in his, not hard, just a small pressure, a child gripping something the way children grip the edge of a pool before they've learned to trust the water. He crouched again, the second time that hour, his knees protesting in the language of a body that had ridden too many miles to fold easily anymore, and he held the boy's eyes the way he'd learned to hold a man's eyes across a debriefing table, steady, giving nothing away that wasn't meant to be given. "You don't have to say anything," he said. "Not now. Not ever, if that's what it takes." The boy looked past him, out across the yard, at the long, unbroken line of leather and gray hair and folded arms, at machines gone quiet and cooling, in a field that had never held this many men at once in its whole worn-out history, and something moved behind his eyes that Gunnar recognized because he had felt it himself, decades ago, in a rice paddy, the specific moment when a person understands they are not, after all, going to be left alone with the worst thing that ever happened to them. The caseworker came down the last step slowly, the folder still pressed to her chest, and knelt in the dirt in front of the boy, her knees sinking slightly into the dry ground, and she didn't reach for him. "I need you to tell me what happened," she said, "whenever you're ready." The yard held its breath, 160 men, and one old veteran, and a woman kneeling in the dust, waiting on a boy who hadn't spoken in a year to decide if today was the day. The wind came through then, low across the field, carrying the smell of diesel and cut grass and something sweeter underneath it. The last of the lilacs gone to seed along the fence line, and the boy's hand found the pocket of his jeans, the one he had kept his fist curled around all morning, and did not come out. Gunnar watched the small knuckles work beneath the denim, a slow kneading, the motion of someone deciding something with his hands before his mouth caught up. Nobody moved. 160 men who had ridden 3 hours through heat that cracked the tar on the county road stood in that yard and did not shift their weight, did not clear their throats, did not do any of the small, restless things men do when they want a moment to be over. They let it be as long as it needed to be. The caseworker did not repeat herself. She had done this before. Gunnar could see it in the stillness of her, the specific patience of someone who had knelt in 100 yards like this one, in front of 100 children who had learned that silence was the only room in the house where nothing could be taken from them. She simply waited, her knees printed with dust, her eyes level with the boy's, and let the folder rest against her chest, like something she had stopped needing. The boy's mouth opened, closed, opened again, and this time a sound came out of it, small and rough, like a door that hadn't turned on its hinge in a long time. Not words yet, just breath shaped into the beginning of something, and Gunnar felt his own chest go tight, in a way it hadn't since the letter, since the folded flag, since every ending he'd carried without a body to bury. "It's all right," the caseworker said, so quiet it barely reached the second row of bikes. "Take your time." The boy's eyes lifted from her face to the line of riders behind her, moved down the row, the way a man reads a fence for the weak post, and stopped on Gunnar. He held that look a long moment, the kind of look that asks a question no one has taught a child how to ask out loud. "Are you still going to be here after I say it?" And Gunnar answered the only way he knew, which was to not look away, to not so much as blink, to let the boy see there was nothing behind his eyes but the willingness to stay. Somewhere behind them a screen door creaked on its spring and did not open. Somewhere farther off a dog began barking and was hushed by a hand nobody saw. The boy's shoulders dropped an inch, the specific inch of a person setting down a weight they have carried so long they've forgotten it has a shape, and his lips parted once more, and this time a word almost came. It did not come as speech first. It came as breath, a small pull of air through the nose that every man on that lawn recognized, because every man on that lawn had once stood at the edge of saying something that would cost him everything to say, and had needed that same half-second to gather the nerve. The caseworker did not move. She had learned, in 14 years of standing in yards like this one, that the worst thing a grown person can do to a child on the verge of speech is to lean toward it. So she stayed where she was, knees bent, clipboard forgotten against her thigh, and let the distance between herself and the boy remain exactly what it had been. The wind came up off the dead field behind the house, carrying the smell of scorched grass and diesel and, faintly, the mineral smell of the creek 200 yards east that had not run since July. It moved the boy's hair off his forehead. It moved nothing else. "Tags," the boy said. The word arrived cracked and thin, the voice of someone who had not used the muscles for it in so long that the sound came out unpracticed, like a hinge finally turned after a year of rust. But it was a word. It was his word, offered whole, not coaxed out of him with a question, not translated through a note folded 4 times in a pocket. The caseworker's pen did not move to the clipboard. She only looked at him, and something in her face came undone in a way that had nothing to do with procedure. "I want my tags back," he said, and this time the sentence came easier. The second sentence always does, the body remembering faster than the mind expects. His eyes had not left Gunner's face. Gunner's hand was already moving before he told it to. He drew the tags from his jacket pocket, the 2 stamped ovals warm from being carried against his chest since the gas station. The ball chain still looped the way the boy had first pressed it into his palm, and he crossed the 6 feet of dead grass between them, not fast, not slow, the way a man approaches a spooked animal he intends to keep. He crouched. He held the tags out flat on his open palm, the way he had once been taught to hold water for a horse that did not trust his hand yet. The boy looked at them a long moment before he took them. Then he closed his fingers around the metal, and for the first time since the gas station, since the funeral, since whatever nameless morning this had all truly begun on, his face did something none of the 160 men standing in that yard had yet seen it do. It began, unmistakably, to come back to life. It was not a smile, not yet. It was something before a smile, the way dawn is something before morning, a loosening around the eyes, a small collapse of the muscles that had been holding his face rigid for 300 and some days, muscles that had learned to guard against feeling the way a man learns to guard a wound. He did not cry. That would come later, and privately, in a bathroom with the door locked and the water running so no one would hear. Here, in the yard, in front of 160 men who had ridden 400 miles on the strength of a note folded into a boy's coat pocket, he simply looked down at the tags in his hand and turned them over once, the way a man checks a coin is real. The caseworker had gone very still. She had a pen in her hand that she was not using. Somewhere behind her, one of the patched men, a big one, gray-bearded, the kind who looked like weather had made him rather than a mother, made a sound low in his chest that he did not try to explain to anyone standing near him. The boy looked up. He looked past Gunner, past the caseworker, out at the wall of leather and denim and sun-faded ink that ringed the yard like something out of an Old Testament, men standing the way men stand at a graveside, hats off where they had hats, hands folded or hanging loose at their sides, none of them speaking, all of them watching a 9-year-old hold 2 pieces of stamped metal as if the metal itself might disappear if he stopped believing in it. "They came," the boy said, not a question, a fact he was still testing the weight of. "They came," Gunner said. The stepfather had not moved from the porch steps in some time. He sat with his elbows on his knees, looking at the ground between his boots, the way men look at ground when they have run out of places to look that don't cost them something. Nobody spoke to him. Nobody needed to. The silence of 160 men was doing more work in that yard than any accusation could have, and he seemed to understand this the way a man understands weather, not reasoned with, only endured. The caseworker crouched now too, notebook forgotten on her knee, and asked the boy, gently, the way you ask a question you already fear the answer to, whether there was anything else he wanted, anything at all. He thought about it. He held the tags against his sternum with both hands. The ball chain looped once around his knuckles. "I want to keep these," he said. His voice cracked on the last word, not from emotion but from disuse, like a door swung open after a long winter shut. "They're yours," Gunner said. "They were always yours." The boy nodded, once, like a man closing a ledger, and then, for the first time since anyone in that yard had known him, he looked like he might, eventually, be a child again. The wind picked up around then, the way it does in the last hour before dusk on the high plains, carrying dust and the smell of diesel and something green underneath it, alfalfa maybe, from a field 3 properties over, that nobody had bothered to plant this year. Nobody in the yard moved to leave. That was the thing the caseworker would mention later, in the report she filed, and then, months after, in a phone call she made to a number that was not on any form, that no one left. 160 men who had places to be, debts of their own, wives and daughters and Sunday shifts, stood in that yard past the point where, standing there, served any purpose except the purpose of being seen standing there. The stepfather went inside eventually, not ordered to, just worn down by the weight of being looked at by that many eyes that asked nothing and forgave nothing. The screen door banged twice behind him, the second time louder, like something in him wanted the sound to mean more than it did. The boy did not watch him go. He was looking at the tags, turning them over the way a man reads a letter he has already memorized, checking the words are still there. Gunnar crouched again, slower this time, his knees announcing themselves the way they had for a decade now, a small tax on every act of tenderness. He did not reach for the boy. He had learned that much, sometime between the funeral and the gas station and this yard, that reaching was a taking, even when it was meant as a giving. He waited instead, the way he had waited in triple canopy jungle for a sound that might be nothing, or might be everything, patience worn into him so deep, it no longer felt like a virtue, only a habit. "Your daddy," Gunnar said. "He'd have been real proud of you today." The boy did not answer that. He looked instead at the sky going copper at its lower edge, the sun folding itself down toward a horizon interrupted by nothing but fence line and the black shapes of men and machines. Somewhere behind them a truck engine turned over and settled into idle, patient, waiting for a signal that had not yet been given. The caseworker rose, brushed the dust from her knees, and said something quiet into a phone that Gunnar did not try to hear. It was not his business yet what came next, the paperwork, the placement, the long, grinding machinery of a system that moves slow even when it moves right. That was tomorrow's wait. Tonight there was only the boy, and the tags, and a yard full of men who had ridden 200 miles to stand still. Autumn came to Iron Ridge the way it always did, without ceremony. The cottonwoods along the dry creek bed turning the color of old brass and dropping their leaves onto a highway that had seen nothing that August except heat and dust and, for one evening, 160 motorcycles parked in a farmyard, like a congregation that had forgotten how to pray out loud. The stepfather did not come back. There were court dates, and then there were fewer of them, and then there was only a signature on a form that placed the boy with an aunt 2 counties over, a woman with a spare room, and a garden, and no history of disappointing him. Gunnar drove out there twice that fall, unannounced both times, and both times the boy came to the porch rail before the engine had finished ticking, and both times he said something small. "Is it cold where you sleep?" "Did you eat?" The way a person tests a bridge before deciding it will hold his weight again. By the time the first snow came, the boy was talking in whole sentences to his teacher, and by spring he had stopped flinching when a door closed hard somewhere in the house. Nobody called it healed. Gunnar didn't believe in that word, not for the boy and not for himself. He believed in something closer to distance traveled, miles put between a man and the thing that had tried to keep him still. The dog tags stayed on the boy's dresser in a coffee can that had once held nails, and once a year, near the date his father had died, Gunnar rode out and the two of them sat on the tailgate and didn't say much of anything, and that not saying had become its own kind of conversation. The club never spoke of that evening as a rescue. Rescue implied a fire, a flood, something with an ending you could point to. What they had done was simpler and harder to name. They had shown up, and stood, and let a silence hold more weight than any threat could have. That was the thing Gunnar told the newer riders when they asked what the patch on his cut was for, the small embroidered dog tag stitched crooked by somebody's wife who'd never sewn before, and never let anyone say so. He told them it wasn't for a fight one. It was for a boy who found 6 words in a farmyard full of men, who could have said 1,000, and chose instead to let him be the loudest sound in the yard. Some Sundays, riding the flat road out past the gas station where it had started, Gunnar still slowed near the pumps, out of habit more than hope, and looked at the gravel shoulder where a boy had once pressed something heavier than metal into his palm. There was nothing there now but heat shimmer and the long white line of the highway running on toward whatever came next. That was fine. Not every place needs a marker. Some just need a man who remembers and